lot I did not understand about the process of being asked to resign. God did make it incredibly clear, from that meeting on Friday afternoon with the athletic director. Over the next 72 hours, there were so many different things that happened, and God made it clear this was His plan for my life, and He was using obviously human means and a very real, conversation of, hey, this is we're moving in a different direction. One quick example of that is after the athletic director left the office, the very next thing I was getting ready to do was to go do a little Bible lesson for some elementary school kids, and it was the Good News Club. So I was looking up what was the topic for that day. I hadn't looked at it yet. I was getting ready to look at it. The athletic director leaves the office. I start preparing for that news club, but it's just a little short lesson that I was going to teach. And the lesson for that day, the main point was let God guide you. And I know there's a lot of people that go through transitions and they don't necessarily always have the benefit or that assurance, at least in a tangible way. I felt like for me it was a very tangible thing in God's kindness where I was able to see, let God guide you. So this is true for elementary school kids, and this is also true for me as a 35-year-old who now is looking to transition to something else in life.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to 3 Hospitality, Hope, and Hustle. Today we've got Coach McCormick, or at least that's how I know him, and he will be talking with us about a few different aspects of life. I'll give a quick introduction, just like I've done with the others. I knew Coach pretty much when I started to look at colleges. Got a chance to meet him before school started. Had a couple different opportunities to look elsewhere, but felt that Bob Jones was the best place to go, both from a school aspect and from and being able to work and play for Coach there. And then spent the next 2 years playing soccer under his tutelage, I guess you could say. Definitely some downs, definitely some ups. Since then, a lot has changed. No longer coaching, but we'll kind of get into that a little bit. So welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. Appreciate you having me on today, AJ.
Yeah, I can't wait to get some more knowledge. It's been a few years since I've had your coaching. So right now, we're going to go over a few different subjects. But to start with, since this is kind of where, from what I remember and, more relatable, at least for me, looking back at your years at Bob Jones, how did those years at Bob Jones shape your views on leadership and personal growth through coaching?
I mean, I think when I was there, I really love to see players excel on the field and off the field to their full potential, whatever that looked like. And as I think about how did those experiences shape my approach to life today, I think about that idea of striving for excellence. Obviously, as an athlete, as a soccer player at the college level, it's incredibly important to strive for excellence. And so I think that's one thing that as I was trying to encourage others to do that, even with life changes and transition, and whatever God calls me to, whether that's my faith and am I living with an eternal perspective, whether that's from a family perspective as a father and a husband, whether it's work, it's that idea of striving for excellence.
So that striving for excellence, was that something that that came about during those years, or was it something that you had in your head going into coaching that was always kind of a driver, or is it something that you developed while you were coaching?
I think it grew as I was coaching. I think that's kind of something that I had before coaching, that idea, but I think coaching really helped confirm what that looked like to strive for excellence. And so I think it was certainly a growing process, but I don't think I really fully realized the context outside of sports as much until I had finished coaching and then started to contemplate even more what that looked like outside the coaching world. I know with the idea of excellence, after coaching, that idea seems to be more and more elusive. Like it's hard to strive for that, or it's hard to actually meet that goal of being excellent. So I think something that's kind of come alongside that is just the idea of faithfulness. So faithfulness to striving for excellence in what God has called me to. So I think for all young men out there, whether it's work, marriage, husband, father, different relationships, involvement in church, that idea of being faithful and striving for excellence in what God has called us to, that's something that continues to resonate with me more and more, is the idea of excellence combined with faithfulness as I move past the coaching experience.
Yeah, I think that's great. Our church is going through with a group of men. It's a book, and it's like the way to success. There's a bunch of books out there with that title, but it's by Jeff Little. Anyway, he talks about the idea of success and what that looks like from a Christian's perspective. And I think in a lot of ways, like you said, coaching, it's easier to say, okay, I'm successful if I win the championship. Easy things to pinpoint. But as you get outside of that and you're looking at church, well, what does success look like for a young man in church? There's no I won because I invited the most people. Like there's no necessarily goal or easy way to mark it and say I'm successful in this. And even in career and life, finding that kind of more and more. So yeah, I can definitely see what you mean, and but that's our goal or our focus, right? The faith to strive, our faithfulness in striving for excellence or success, and what that looks like for a Christian. So yeah, I think that's great. So to get back kind of to where we were, so now excellence is no longer coaching. So excellence is now something else. So what inspired the move, or was it even a choice necessarily, or was it something that you're almost pushed, not necessarily a decision?
Yeah, I think that word inspired, I think it's a great word, but I think for me, it might be better fit to say even what motivated me to move, because and I think most people know this, but some listening may not. So I got asked to resign from my job, which, as the coach, and that was something for me that was hard. I've never had that happen before or since in any of my jobs that I've had previously. And so that was something that was very difficult and very hard. And there's certainly aspects of that I didn't understand. And so what motivated me was really trying to figure out, how can I provide for my family? Should I be doing to provide for my family? And I love coaching, and there are a lot of things I really still do miss about coaching. But at that time, trying to evaluate how can I provide for my family, I didn't necessarily feel like it was God's will for us to move. I'm open to that. I didn't necessarily feel like that was His will. So there's obviously a limited number of opportunities where you can have a full-time job coaching and provide for the family solely through coaching. And so that's what kind of started me to explore down other routes. Now, and I will say too, while there's a lot I did not understand about the process of being asked to resign, God did make it incredibly clear, from that meeting on Friday afternoon with the athletic director, and over the next 72 hours, there were so many different things that happened that God made it clear this was His plan for my life, and He was using obviously human means and a very real conversation of, hey, this is we're moving in a different direction. One quick example of that is after the athletic director left the office, the very next thing I was getting ready to do was to go do a little Bible lesson for some elementary school kids, and it was the Good News Club. So I was looking up what was the topic for that day. Hadn't looked at it yet, was getting ready to look at it. Athletic director leaves the office. I start preparing for that news club, but just a little short lesson that I was going to teach. And the lesson for that day, the main point was, let God guide you. And I know there's a lot of people that go through transitions and they don't necessarily always have the benefit or that assurance, at least in a tangible way. I felt like for me, it was a very tangible thing in God's kindness where I was able to see, let God guide you. So this is true for elementary school kids, and this is also true for me as a 35-year-old who now is looking to transition to something else in life, or at least something other than the current job that I have. So yeah, I think I was motivated to provide for my family. So that meeting with the athletic director was what pushed me. And then I think too, as far as, motivated me to transition to go into home inspections, with someone from Find Great People who does consulting for those that are in transition. And we were just looking at what different aspects of what I enjoy doing where what I'm suited for, and I really enjoyed helping people, and I really and I had a background in construction as well, so I had first got out of college, I was in construction full time for a few years and doing soccer part time. Then I flipped that, and even after that, I was still doing some different renovation work with construction things. So through that process with Find Great People, the idea of being a home inspector, where I can use the construction background and knowledge, and then also help people as they're making this important purchase. Those are things that kind of push me to take that step to go down the route of starting as a home inspector.
And I want to touch back a little bit when you had said after the athletic director had left, there you had to prepare a lesson. I think a lot of people in that moment would have said, I'm not going to prepare a lesson. Like, I just got asked to resign. I have other more important things to do, and maybe would have just come up with some lesson, just some random Bible story or something to talk through. But I think it says a lot about who you are, and what I believe a lot of men can learn from is even in the moments, or in the exact moment of what some could say as defeat, or at least feeling as defeat, you looked and said, what is the most important thing? And it's these kids, it's good news, it's the Bible, and I think that is really good for a lot of guys to hear. I was talking with a gentleman again in this men's group, and he was talking about, for the past year, he's been working on a lot of different things, but his main was every week his reaction to things that go wrong get better. So instead of turning to something else to fulfill it, but instead of turning away, is good, away from the defeat, but turning away to what? Self-loathing? Is it turning to pity? What are you turning away from? I'm going to think of Christ. I'm going to go to Christ. I'm not going to be able to do these on my own. That whole idea, it says a lot about what a Christian man should strive for in those ultimate moments of decisions or indecision. The transition right now, or at least for me, I'm trying to think, if I was in the same position, it's a huge transition. Was there anything internally or any doubts that were coming up as that transitioning was happening? And how did you manage through those?
That's a great question. I know trying to manage those. Yeah, the doubts, just the uncertainty. I think the biggest word that comes to mind, this is probably true for a lot of people going through transition or significant life change, is just that idea of uncertainty. And so the last 10 plus years, kind of in some ways, my role as a coach or a mentor or a teacher were things that there's a certain amount of identity that was placed in those things. And I think it's a good reminder as Christian men, the importance of our identity being in God, so that while vocations and jobs and roles or life circumstances may change, those are things that can change. Our identities in God, but it is, practically speaking, as again, being someone that is coaching, and that's what I'm doing for a job. And to be honest, I felt a lot of fulfillment in trying to strive for success on the field, but also seeing the players' growth on and off the field. Some of that was in spite of me. Hopefully, some of that was because of me. But trying to create an environment where we're not just me. We had a great group of guys on the team, and trying to foster and create that environment of spiritual growth in young people, and having a meaningful part in the life of a young person. I mean, that was very fulfilling. So that was probably the biggest change for me, is to go into a job where that aspect of ministry or outreach on a very regular basis was changing and transitioning. And to be honest, that's one of the things I still miss, to this day, is that aspect of it.
Are you still involved in the Good News Club or anything like that right now?
Not the Good News Club. And to be honest, I've wife Kim, and then my son who's 9, and then 2 daughters, 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. And with life circumstances, at this time, really trying to be faithful where he has me at with my family, and then also involved with the church where I'm at. And so there's that constant I don't want to, constant might be a little bit strong, but there is a very regular sense for me of missing those opportunities and trying to navigate how I can provide for my family. And my wife does a great job with homeschooling and co-ops and other things. She's not having to work right now. But I would love to make her create more time in my schedule to provide opportunities for some of those different outreach opportunities, if you will, with young people. At the same time, I think one of the dangers is there's I can spend so much time or energy trying to reach out to others. I'm not doing that effectively with my own kids or with my wife, and so that's where it's a definitely a balance for me right now.
What are some practical steps young men can take to find direction during those periods of transition?
So a few thoughts. I say get advice from others. So that could be parents, family members, pastors, or just other faithful Christians. Proverbs talks a lot about wisdom, and there's others that have wisdom. So trying to gain advice from those, and I think too, just praying and reading the Bible. Sometimes we think we have to read all, and it's good to read books. It's good to be educated. It's good to ask people for advice, but also the book of Proverbs does have a lot of just very practical advice for work and how you should work and what work looks like. And so I think just prayerfully considering what God would have and reading the Bible. And then I also think another practical step, something that's been helpful for me, is just to read helpful articles. DesiringGod.org is probably one of my go-to favorites for articles and on any number of things. It just provides a good Christian perspective, whether it's work-related, family-related, transitions in life, different circumstances in life, trials, any number of things. I think, practically speaking, trying to fill our mind with truth from Scripture and get advice from others that have either knowledge in the field that can help direct your steps for different things, and or ideally both knowledge, but also from a Christian perspective to say, not just what are you good at, but what do you think God is calling you to as you're looking to make a transition and going from there.
That's great. DesiringGod.com. You said
Yeah,
.org?
desiringgod.org.
Yeah. Okay.
They have just a lot of articles on there that are helpful. And again, it's not focused on work or transition, but they've got thousands of articles and they touch on almost any area of life. That's been a helpful resource for me.
The journey that you've been on, at least, and probably still are on, a lot of young men are going to have faced their own transitions from college to career, personal life, getting married, having kids. You touched on it a little bit, but a transition to where it's a completely different field. How did you kind of redefine yourself, and did you ever feel like, maybe I'm not supposed to be doing this? What kind of advice would you give to other young people that are in that transition that may be having those thoughts like, I'm not supposed to be here? Maybe, I'm sure a lot of people hear the imposter syndrome, like if people really knew what I was doing or how I was doing, they'd say, oh, you're not supposed to be here. Any advice for young men kind of in that transition and defining themselves?
I think sometimes we have these ideals of what life is supposed to look like for us, and I think we have to come back to the truth that we're supposed to be faithful wherever God has us at. So I think there is a big caution if someone is really discontent in where they're at, they can still live and act in a way that is faithful, is living out their faith in a very real way. And sometimes God uses circumstances to push someone in a direction that they may or may not want to be in. And I don't say that I enjoy the home inspection job. I'm enjoying that aspect of things. But I think there's just that idea of sometimes there's different seasons in life where it's important to continue to build habits of being faithful, whether it's a job you love, whether it's a transition you were anticipating or you weren't anticipating, to act in a way that reflects who you are as a Christian. And I think too, when there's transition or times like this, it's really important to build habits of trusting God during times of uncertainty. So a job transition is one, but there's any number of different things related to family or kids, life circumstances in general. And it's every time you have that opportunity to either, turn and feel bad for yourself or have an inward focus on why is this happening to me? I think, it's incredibly important to build habits in the little and the big things that happen in life, to trust God during times of uncertainty, and that's kind of will help prepare you for whatever God has for the future as well.
It hasn't just been you making kind of that transition. You're obviously your wife, and at the time, I think the transition was happening. You had two, right? And so obviously a little bit more pressure now. It's not just, oh, well, I'll try this, and now I'm gonna have to start over. Was it hard? Was your wife surprised, or was she kind of, how did that, how did her role play a part in, that decision to move into ACE, and kind of that transition as well, kind
Yeah,
of her role?
it's interesting because personality is a little bit different, and to be honest, it was probably more not probably. I mean, it was more upsetting and confusing and frustrating for my wife than it was for me. So the job transition in that process of being asked to resign, that hurt my wife. It really did. And while it affected me, for me, it was kind of like, okay, this is the situation. So I need to find something else. So for me, it was kind of, okay, I need to move on and see what God has for me, whatever that is. Because obviously, initially, I didn't know. It was kind of a process of time to figure that out. But it was hard for my wife to go through that. And it was harder for her than for me. I still had a lot of connections at back at the university, and a lot of the players there I still felt connected to. So it was hard for me to completely move on because of some of those personal connections that I had. Where my wife, it was harder for her to be around that, aspect, or just to think about that process of what that looked like or what that felt like for her. And so that was something that we had to work through.
Was there something in particular that I don't want to say made things better? Was it just time? Was it intentional discussions? My wife and I have had conversations when something maybe didn't go the way that I wanted to at work or elsewhere, and she was definitely more upset about it than I was, which almost made it easier for me to not be as upset because she was upset for me. Any advice for men in that aspect?
Yeah. Two thoughts. One, time does help the situation. That was the case for us. And then two, it's trying to be thoughtful in the communication. So while we want to have open conversations and try and work through things, we don't need to keep tearing off a wound that's trying to heal. So for us, it was just a little bit more, mostly time and space to let things heal, and not bringing the same thing up on a daily basis of what that process looked like. That's what it looked like for our family.
Okay, that's great. Some of us will have these transitions probably sooner than others, and probably have dealt with some of this stuff earlier, but some people may not go through quite a transition or change until they're later in life. So kind of having these foundational conversations hopefully will provide a good foundation with all of this and kind of what we've talked about. I'd say you've probably developed a bit of resilience, and from that, moving from a structured role, like coaching, where there's a time and a place. Was it a big change, or were you able to find that same structure in the business? And then what did you learn about resilience and adapting that young men should need to hear, or would be surprised to hear?
Yeah, so I think those are two great traits to have. And I think on the soccer side, one of the struggles with coaching was the nights and the weekends with a young family. In any environment, even a Christian environment, but especially in any type of secular environment. So that's one of the reasons I transitioned over to something outside of that, coaching. And I think the resilience, the perseverance, in the structure, there's been a certain amount of that I've always kind of been forced to do, at least since getting out of college. I know a lot of people would say that happened in college. To be honest, for me, there's certain areas I could have been more structured probably in college, probably about the most structured I was in college, although I certainly made an effort in college. I mean, I was structured in regards to certain aspects of fitness and soccer that carried
Hmm.
over. And then honestly, from a spiritual standpoint, that's really when I grew some in having that structure. But now transitioning from soccer and coaching to, working for myself, for me, the structure had to be there. I needed to provide for my family. So I needed to get the business up and running. And initially I thought there was a chance I might be working or partnering with another inspector to kind of get going on things. And I quickly learned that just wasn't going to be the best option or the best fit. So pretty quickly I had to have a lot of structure in place to really get the education, the license I need to become a home inspector, and just that resilience to kind of persevere and to keep prayerfully reaching out and trying to foster relationships with realtors and others and connect with people who could start providing work for me. And then I also had someone from our church who was a licensed contractor who for a few months I did some subcontract work for, just construction related work until I was able to fully support the family with home inspections.
Greenville's got a very strong community of believers. I think there are a lot of businesses that are Christian based. In my conversation with Garrett, we discussed how a lot of businesses in Greenville, and probably not just Greenville, but they almost use their beliefs as a way to gain more, get more, as like yeah, we're a Christian company. In reality, they're just using it because they know that Greenville happens to be a very Christian town. And so we talked a little bit about it, and he talked about kind of how he came up with his name and how he originally wanted it to have a little bit more of a Christian motto or name to it, but was instructed to figure something out. And the analogy that he brought up was the analogy of the Sunday brunch or Sunday lunch group that comes out, just stereotypically aren't the best tippers. And in the same way, he likened it to a business that stamps Christian as the first thing that people see about them, instead of letting their service, their hospitality, their business model, whatever it is, let it speak for themselves. I wasn't sure if you had any kind of any experience with some of those companies, or if you feel the same way, or maybe you've had a different experience.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just trying to be thoughtful about how to practically live out your faith. So, to Garrett's point, just because you put something on a sign or, have something, something visible out there, it's only as good as what you're doing day in and day out. So for me, the approach I take, and I'll be honest, I work with a lot of different realtors, but naturally there's going to be people that we work with that we have a history with, or that someone's connected us to someone. And so there's a lot of camaraderie on that front, but there's also just a lot of realtors out there that just want to find a good home inspector to work with that's going to be honest, that's going to do what they say they're going to do. They're going to show up. They're going to provide a thorough inspection. They're going to try and provide, detailed, helpful information to the clients without unnecessarily sending them into a panic or scaring them from the information that's there. So for me, it's just trying to live out my faith in how I communicate and just being professional in the business that I do, and then just trying to from there think about what does that look like. And that is, to be honest, that is one of the challenges in an environment when you're expected to be Christian, like at a Christian university or in a church type of environment. It's easy to have certain conversations. And for me, a lot of my days, I'm by myself at a house doing an inspection. Occasionally I have interaction with realtors or buyers in person, but that's not always the case. But it's trying to be thoughtful how I can live out my faith in those situations.
Greenville, great place to live. Faith, family are huge there. And I know they're huge in your life as well. And they're a great way to keep you grounded and remember kind of why you're doing things and why you are transitioning or why you're moving. How does your faith influence your decision making, both in your family and business life? And is there any kind of guiding principles or verses that you lean on in particular?
There's this underlying piece when you know that God is in control of everything. So I think as a Christian husband, father, business owner, there is a certain amount of peace. While we want to be diligent to do the best we can in these different areas, when something is going the complete opposite way of how you want it to go, whether that's in business, whether that's a family situation, or whether that's maybe personal goals for the future or now that you have in place, that God's in control, it does provide this kind of assurance or this peace that I don't think is natural. And so, give the analogy of everything else is changing, but whatever the foundation is on, using that building example, and the Bible talks about it, is your foundation like sand or is it on a rock? And so I think having God as that foundation and recognizing that He's in control of all things provides a certain sense of stability when there's a lot of other things in life that might not feel stable or might feel uncertain. And for me, a verse that comes to mind is Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, where it says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't depend on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge Him and He will direct your path." And that's kind of been a theme verse of mine all throughout my life, but then especially as I was getting out of college and starting into the construction world and starting into coaching. And then through every transition, that verse has been something that has been a good kind of anchor and a reminder just to trust the Lord with my whole heart. And I'm not just depending on what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to acknowledge Him. And then it's a promise that He will direct your path. He will direct my path. So those are things that provide great encouragement and great hope for me as I think about balancing career and family and personal goals.
Do you find that it's easier to rely on those verses when things are going wrong or when they're going right?
I think when they're going right, the human tendency is to not be as thankful to God for how He's orchestrated your steps and orchestrated my steps for these things. When they're going right, it might just be going through the motions and not really actively thinking how much God cares for us and loves us and wants what's best for us. I think when things are hard and we're kind of searching for answers, sometimes that's when we're most likely to be reminded of these truths and more to cling to these truths out of a hope, because we're looking for hope somewhere and we're reminded that we have this hope, but we've failed to recognize who we should be looking to and who we should be trusting in. And I would suspect that a lot of people are like that. If not, maybe it's just me, but I would suspect for most people, when things are going well, we forget to thank God and recognize for how He's in control. And when things aren't going well and we're searching, we're reminded where we really can find this assurance and this hope.
That's great. I think, balancing career and career goals and managing, again, we talked a little bit at the beginning where right now there's not necessarily something that you're like, this defines success or this, I don't know if there's a home inspection award for, I'm sure there's a, better, they rate the town like best home inspector in Greenville. I don't know. That's a thing. But what are your career goals and then how do they correlate to the family and making sure that you're finding that balance?
On a practical level, it's to provide for my family, and especially so that my wife does not have to work, at least while the kids are young. So my youngest she just turned 4. And, once she gets into school, we might exploring other things. But for right now, it's trying to say, what can I do to care for my family in a way where my wife is able to be home with the kids, to teach them, to disciple them. And I want to be doing the same, right? So I don't want to be working, and it's a fine balance. I don't want to be working so much where I'm not involved in doing that. But as far as the career goals go, it's trying to be faithful as a home inspector. And I'm thankful. I'm, through the ups and downs, it's, the last 5 to 6 years, people ask me how it's going. I say, from a home inspector perspective, it's either been a good busy or a crazy busy, very consistently for me. So I'm thankful for that. I continue to work with more and more realtors. And so thankful for how God's really provided for the family. In the back of my mind, I don't have any plans to transition out of home inspections anytime in the near future. In the back of my mind, there's still aspects of coaching or just discipling or mentoring young people, whether it's high school or college, where, curious to see what God has in the future, kind of taking it one day at a time. And right now, this is where God has me.
During those 5 years, did you have a moment where you were either working too much, or you were getting to the point where it's like, okay, how did you find that balance? Was there a moment there like, okay, that is too much, or that's not quite enough?
That's a great question, this might be jumping ahead to some other things as well, but um, you know, I will say this: my wife and I would probably have different answers to that question. Because it's still a learning and growing process. I certainly have not figured it out. There are certain weeks I think to myself, I really worked too much this week. Rarely do I think to myself I did not work as much as I should have. I'll put it that way. It's
Okay.
more often that I work too much. At the same time, as you know, as everyone listening to this podcast know, things are not getting cheaper either. So between some of the different inflation, for those that are listening that may have kids or a young family, or they're starting off in school or doing other things, expenses do add up, and running your own business, and not having necessarily paid time off or insurance provided by an employee,
Hmm.
or employer, there's some of those expenses that do just add up. So as far as trying to balance it, one practical note of advice I would say, and again, I don't say this because I've mastered this. I say this because I continually need to do this. But is communicating, if you have a spouse, communicating with your spouse expectations and setting boundaries to try and make sure we're honoring each other in the way that we approach and handle the demands of work, the demands of family, and how to provide. I think that communication is key.
I'm sure along these lines, starting a business, obviously being a father, being a husband, a lot of men, and kind of what we've been taught, at least before, was to not be vulnerable, to not open up, to not show emotion. So, in your role, both as businessman, husband, father, and at one point coach, how did your view of vulnerability play in your approach to all of those different areas? And has it changed over time? And any advice for young men that, maybe they should be more vulnerable or less vulnerable, or what does vulnerable mean at all?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to be fair, that's probably something I still struggle with. It's a fine line of trying to um, be vulnerable in certain areas about what the struggles are. And I think some of that is going to be the context of close relationships and who you're talking with. And obviously, the wife should be the best friend and the one you're communicating and being the most vulnerable with. But you also, as a husband, you want to guard your wife so you're not adding unnecessary burden to what she feels like she's carrying. So you want to be vulnerable to the point that it's helpful, but if it starts to be hurtful, and don't get me wrong, there might be conflict, there might be certain things you need to be vulnerable about to work through to come out stronger on the other side, but there might be certain aspects like for you, AJ, with your work environment, there might be certain times at work that something happens, and certain things a lot of things you might want to talk with your wife about, but there might be some things that happen that it's going to be really hard for your wife to hear. It's going to make her angry or upset or frustrated. And some of those things might be good to talk with her about and work through. And some of those things, she doesn't need to hear that every single day. So
Yeah.
sometimes you might just need to, talk to another friend, someone at church, an older mentor, to get advice on how do I handle this situation, and being vulnerable to the right person. Again, most of the time that should be the wife, but there could be situations where it might be someone else, and sometimes it might need to be a pastor or a Christian businessman to try and get advice on how do I handle this very difficult situation.
How are you handling it with your son? Because I know, at least for me, finding that balance between, you obviously want to be a strong leader. You don't want him to fall over and start to cry. So like, finding that balance between, okay, when is it okay for us to get down and be vulnerable, and when is it where's that balance between vulnerable and it's time to, you're getting older, like I'm trying
Yeah,
to.
I think like with my son, and part of it with just the kids in general, it's being vulnerable. So like if I sin and I mess up, if I get angry with my wife and I use harsh words, or if I get angry with my son and use harsh words that I shouldn't use, and I just come across with a mean spirit, it's asking their forgiveness. So I'm being vulnerable in that
Mm.
I'm recognizing that, like with my son Wells, hey, dad was really harsh with his words. I was not, that's not right. Will you forgive me for that? That's not how I should be acting. I want to honor God. And I love you very much. I don't want to communicate with you in that way. So I think a lot of that is just from a Christian perspective, is being vulnerable by being humble enough to admit our sin and confess our sin, and to try and model that as we interact with our kids. I think that's one important fact.
I got one more thought for you. You faced challenges through coaching, business. If there's one habit that you have or something that you do on a regular basis that made the biggest impact, what would it be?
Biggest impact, I think maybe like a mindset shift. One mindset shift for me, being married, having kids, being involved in church, running a business, that can kind of feel like a cycle where you don't you don't always know when you're making progress and when you're just getting up and doing the same thing. And circling back to something I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I think just asking myself the question, am I being faithful to what God has called me to? So a mindset shift of not just accomplishing goals, but a shift of thinking about, am I being faithful to what God has called me to? And I think that would be maybe a mindset shift that is kind of taken place to some extent. And then I think maybe one habit would be trying to be thoughtful in the content that I take in. In particular, I mean, and guys that I coached and that knew me, they might laugh when I say social media, because they realized that was not my strong suit. But the habit of taking in content that is provides a biblical perspective on life, I think that is important. So like, get up in the morning is my first response to go check my email for work, or is it to check the news, or is it social media, or is it am I reading the Bible? If I have 5 or 10 minutes, do I consistently use that? And again, I'm not saying you can never look at other things, but every chance I get, am I just indulging or doing things that kind of take my mind off of life, or am I actually saying, I have 5 or 10 minutes? What are some articles on desiring God that have been recently posted? And is there anything that might be beneficial for me to read or to look at? So I think a habit of trying to take in content that provides biblical perspective on life is something that has been a helpful thing for me as well.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think there's a book, it's called Atomic Habits. And so for a lot of people, I think that's a great habit to get into. And, what's the first thing that you do when you wake up? You have good things, kind of neutral habits, and then you have bad habits. Defining what your goals are and how you want to define your life and start your morning, and then making them happen, I think is huge. Something that I'm trying to get in the habit of, now that my wife and I, we're working out in the morning, because that's the time that we have to be able to do that. So I've been trying to get in the habit of, as soon as she comes into the garage where our little gym setup is, before we do anything, we pray something short. And I'm not going to say that it's every time, because it's usually pretty early in the morning, so neither of us are really awake. But like you said, start our mornings off right. We're not sitting down and browsing emails or Instagram. Our first thoughts are essentially wake up, pray, start our bodies off with the activity, and then we're off to a good start. So I think those habits are key, and in that book, at least so far, has been a great influence in making those habits more regular. So for anybody out there looking for some help, that's a great book. That's pretty much all that I've got for you tonight. I'm still not sure if I should call you Coach or Jesse.
Either one, I still get both. I get Coach, I get Coach McCormick, I get Jesse. I'm good with anything. So,
well, Jesse still seems weird, so I'll probably stick with Coach. But thank you again for coming on and taking the time to talk with us. And maybe one day, maybe a year from now, we'll have you back on and we'll dive into something else.
All right. Sounds good, AJ. Thanks so much.